The first breath I ever took under the mark of the dark gods did not feel like salvation. It felt like drowning. The air burned in my lungs as though some invisible pyre had been lit inside my chest, and the whispers that had once haunted my dreams became deafening in the silence of the waking world. I thought I had chosen freedom, that I had unshackled myself from the yoke of Terra's tyranny. Yet the truth arrived like a blade between the ribs. There is no freedom in chaos, only deeper chains, heavier than any imperial creed could bind. My name has long since been swallowed by the abyss. Now I am nothing but a vessel, a voice among countless voices, a speck of mortal flesh thrown upon the tide of war that consumes the galaxy. And I know even as I march, that my story will end as all cultist stories end, in blood, in fire, and in silence beneath the indifferent stars. Before we descend fully into this tale of damnation, if you find yourself drawn into the shadows of the Imperium's enemies, then walk further with us. Share this path with others who hunger for the forgotten truths of the galaxy, and let your voice linger among ours by subscribing, that we may together descend deeper into the abyss. Chapter 1: Ash and Hunger. The ash always came first, drifting down like a fall snow that clung to skin and tongue alike. It coated the broken ferrocrete of the habstacks, drifted into the mouths of the forgotten, and settled in the seams of rusted manufactorum gates. To breathe was to choke. To live was to taste the remnants of industry, the endless char of furnaces that had long outlasted their purpose. Hunger was constant, gnawing at marrow like a parasite, but the ash was worse. It was the reminder that nothing in this place was clean, that every sunrise was just another day painted gray. I was born into that dust. My first memory is not of my mother's voice or my father's face, but of coughing until my ribs ached, of the sharp sting of iron in my lungs. Food was rationed through the administratum's cold precision, but it rarely reached us intact. By the time the tithes were counted, the overseers had skimmed their share. The gangers had stolen theirs, and what filtered down to our level was fit only for vermin. Bread hard as stone, grain riddled with weevils, meat gray and slick with rot. And still we ate, because to refuse was to die. The Arbites patrolled on occasion, their black carapace armor glinting like obsidian amid the dust storms, but they never lingered long. We were not worth their time. They came to extract compliance, not to protect. And so we learned to bow our heads, to avoid their gaze, to speak only when spoken to. The real law was made in the shadows. The gangs, the smuggler routes, the whispered exchanges of contraband under broken lumen globes. Even then, whispers moved through the ash, threads of something older, something that was not smuggled in crates or carried on void ships. They were voices without faces, promises made in the silence between breaths. At first I thought them dreams. My stomach twisted with hunger so often that delirium was common, hallucinations sparked by malnutrition, yet the whispers never ceased. They came when I slept, curling in my ears with words I did not yet understand. They spoke of liberation, of power, of gods who were not bound to Terra or its emperor. They did not command, they invited. And in a world where the only commands came at the butt of a shock maul, an invitation felt like mercy. The first sign came in blood. A child from our hab block, not much older than myself, vanished one night. Her family wept quietly, for mourning too loudly could draw the Arbites. Weeks later she returned, or rather what remained of her returned. Her eyes were hollow, her skin scarred with crude symbols that seemed carved by fire itself. She spoke no words, only chanted sounds that twisted the air. Her family tried to embrace her, but she did not embrace them back. By dawn the Arbites had taken her away, and her family was gone with her. The whispers in my sleep grew louder that night. It is strange how hunger dulls fear. When your belly is a pit and your veins throb with weakness, terror becomes a luxury you cannot afford. So when the voices called again, I listened. I listened not with belief but with the desperation of one drowning who will grasp even a blade if it is thrown as a rope. They told me the world I knew was a prison, that the Imperium's gaze was not protection but shackles, that my suffering was not meaningless but fuel, a tithe of pain that could be transformed into something greater. I wanted to believe. But belief did not fill an empty stomach, nor mend frostbitten fingers, nor silence the coughs of my kin as ash ate their lungs. I wanted proof. And proof, in this forgotten gutter of the galaxy, would come only in blood and fire. The first time I saw a man killed not by hunger or disease but by choice, it was as though the entire world shifted beneath me. He was a ganger, one of the brutish scavengers who prowled the hab levels armed with rusted blades in the arrogance of those who fed while others starved. He had cornered a boy no older than 12, demanding whatever scraps he carried. But the boy did not cry, nor did he beg. He simply whispered something under his breath, words that seemed to warp the air itself, and in the next heartbeat, the ganger's throat opened as if torn by an invisible claw. Blood sprayed across the wall, steaming where it touched the ferrocrete. The boy dropped the sack of grain and vanished into the alleys, his eyes alight with a fire I had never seen. No arbits came. No sirens wailed. The corpse rotted where it fell, picked apart by vermin and flies. In the days that followed, rumors spread. Rumors of a new power rising, of children who spoke in tongues that bent reality, of forgotten gods whose reach extended even here, in this forsaken dust. Most dismissed it as madness. I did not. I had heard those same whispers in my dreams. It was then I realized the truth. Chaos did not arrive with banners and armies. It seeped like rot, unseen until the foundation crumbled. It crept into the cracks of hunger, into the silence of despair, into the moments when no hope remained. We were already dead in the eyes of the Imperium. Our lives weighed and measured only by the tithes extracted from our suffering. What loyalty did we owe to a throne that had never spoken our names? Still, part of me resisted. I remembered the ecclesiarchy preachers who came once a year, clad in gilded robes and guarded by men with shock mauls. They spoke of the Emperor's light, of the Astronomicon blazing across the stars, of salvation that awaited only the faithful. I wanted to believe them too. I wanted to think my suffering had purpose, but their voices were hollow compared to the whispers. The preacher's words faded with the departure of their ship. The whispers lingered, constant, eternal. One night I followed them. They drew me to the underhalls of the manufactorum, to chambers long abandoned when the machinery had broken down. The air was thick with rust, oil, and decay, yet beneath it all was incense, sweet and cloying, burning in cracked braziers. Shadows danced against the walls, and in those shadows figures moved, cloaked and silent. They did not wear masks of gold or robes of wealth. Their vestments were rags stained with ash and blood, yet the way they moved carried a reverence that no preacher could summon. At their center stood an altar, not carved by master artisans but assembled from scrap metal and bone. Upon it lay a symbol scorched into the metal itself, a mark I could not comprehend but felt resonate deep within my chest. They did not ask my name when I approached. They did not care who I was, only that I had come. And when they spoke, their voices were not their own, but carried the same timbre as the whispers that had haunted my nights. "You are not forgotten," they said. "You are chosen." The words should have terrified me. Instead, they filled me with warmth, a fire my starved body had never known. For the first time I felt seen, not as another faceless wretch choking on ash, not as a number in a tithe ledger, but as a soul whose suffering meant something. They promised me liberation, strength, an end to the gnawing hunger that defined every breath. All they asked in return was devotion. And in that dark chamber, lit only by the glow of braziers and the red gleam of blood upon steel, I whispered yes. The initiation was not immediate. Devotion, they said, had to be proven, and proof was measured not in words but in acts of blood. They did not hand me a blade that first night, nor did they speak of the gods by name. They only watched me with eyes that glimmered in the brazier's glow, their silence heavier than any command. When I returned to the hab block above, everything felt altered, as though the ash tasted different, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. Days bled into weeks, and hunger gnawed, as it always had. Yet now I carried the secret fire inside me. When the Arbites stormed the habs, dragging away entire families for failing their tithes, I no longer felt only fear. I felt anger. A blade of cold fury lodged in my chest, and the whispers sharpened it each night. They reminded me that I was chosen, that my suffering was not a curse but a forge. Each lash of deprivation was a hammer stroke shaping me into something more. The first task came without warning. I was summoned by a scrap of parchment slipped beneath my cot, marked only by a symbol I had glimpsed on the altar. The message contained no words, only a place and a time. I went without hesitation. The underhalls were darker that night, the braziers burning low. Only 3 figures waited. In their hands was a man bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror. I recognized him, an informer, one who whispered to the Arbites when others bartered or hoarded. He had seen my father once conceal a loaf of bread and had sold the knowledge for a few extra rations. My father never returned from the Arbites' cells. Prove yourself, they told me. A knife was pressed into my hand, its blade jagged, its handle sticky with old blood. I stared at the man, trembling, my breath thick in my throat. I had never killed before. I had seen death countless times, but never by my own hand. His muffled pleas meant nothing to them, but to me they sounded like echoes of my father's voice cut short in some unseen cell. The whispers came then, louder than ever. They coiled around my skull, urging, promising, praising me before I had even moved. My hand shook as I raised the blade. For one heartbeat I wanted to refuse, to drop the knife, to run back into the ash and never return. But then I remembered the empty eyes of the Arbites, the endless hunger, the futility of prayers that had never been answered, and I drove the blade down. The sound was wet, final. Blood spilled hot across my hands, and his body jerked once before falling still. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of the braziers. I waited for horror to come, for guilt to shatter me. But instead there was only warmth. The whispers erupted in song, filling every hollow place inside me with fire. I felt strong. I felt alive. The figures nodded. They took the body and vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone with the knife. I returned to the hab block with blood still crusting my hands, but no one spoke, no one asked. It was as if the city itself had already forgotten him. Only I remembered, and in my memory the act did not feel like a crime. It felt like a door opening, and beyond it was a path from which I could never turn back. That night I dreamed of a sky without stars, a vast abyss where colossal shapes stirred in silence. They did not speak in words, but in tides of emotion, surges of hunger, joy, rage, and desire. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, yet I smiled. For I knew then that the Emperor had never watched us, but someone else had. The days that followed were unlike any I had known. The city above remained the same, ash storms choking the sky, Arbites patrols dragging away the weak, children starving in silence. But something within me had shifted forever. Where once I saw only despair, now I saw patterns, signs, movements beneath the surface of things. Every shadow whispered, every silence seemed filled with meaning. The cult no longer tested me with hesitation. Each summons came heavier than the last, tasks of theft, sabotage, silence. Sometimes it was only to watch a place and report. Other times it was to lure a man into a darkened hall where others waited with knives. Each time I obeyed. Each time the fire inside me grew brighter. Yet the fire was not without hunger. It demanded more. When I spilled blood, the warmth swelled, but it faded too quickly. When I whispered the half-prayers at their altars, I felt the vastness stirring, yet always beyond reach, as though mocking me with glimpses of glory. I longed for more than the shadows of power. I longed for the truth. It came one night when they led me deeper than I had ever gone. The tunnels narrowed into veins of stone, until we reached a chamber carved from the bedrock itself. Here the braziers burned with green flame and the air was thick with smoke that stung the lungs. At the center rose an altar of blackened iron, its surface etched with runes I could not comprehend. Upon it lay not a man but a book, its pages bound in cracked pale leather, its script writhing as if alive. The figures bowed low, their faces hidden. One spoke, "You have shed blood. You have proven will. Now you must learn to listen." They placed the book before me. My hands trembled as I touched it. The leather was warm, almost pulsing like flesh. I opened it and the words inside crawled into me, searing themselves against the back of my eyes. They spoke of gods without thrones, of truths buried beneath lies, of powers greater than the Carian emperor who sat rotting on his gilded seat. And as I read, I felt them stir. Not just whispers now, but voices many in one, laughing and weeping, commanding and pleading. They filled me until I could no longer tell where I ended and they began. I fell to my knees, my vision drowning in crimson and shadow. When I awoke, I lay on the cold stone, the book closed beside me. The figures stood in silence, watching. One stepped forward and offered me their hand. I took it, and in that moment I was no longer the starving child of the underhive. I was chosen. That night, as I stumbled back through the tunnels to the surface, the ash storms parted for a heartbeat, revealing a smear of light across the void. Not stars, never stars, but something older, darker, waiting. I smiled through cracked lips, for I knew then that my soul no longer belonged to me. It belonged to them, and so began my true life. Chapter 2. The Knife in the Dark. The cult no longer hid in alleys and forgotten manufactorums. By the time my scars had begun to heal, we were spreading like mold through the city's veins. The Arbits thought they ruled the hab levels, but their grip was brittle. Every patrol, every execution, every tithe only deepened the hunger that fed us. We were everywhere and nowhere at once. Workers in the manufactorums, rag pickers in the ash heaps, even clerks in the tithe offices, each carrying the same secret mark somewhere on our flesh. We called ourselves nothing, because names could be killed. We met by flickering lumen light in the dead of night, whispering prayers into cracked pipes and dripping cisterns. To the city above we were still ghosts, but below in the tunnels a different truth was rising. I had changed too. The whispers were no longer just inside my head. They had weight like hands pressing against my skull. Sometimes when I spoke, my voice was not entirely my own. People listened differently now. Even those older than me lowered their eyes when I passed. I could feel the power humming under my skin, the same way one feels the tremor of a tram before it arrives. Then came the first true strike. Not against a man or a petty informer, but against the Imperium itself. A manufactorum overseer, fat, perfumed, draped in finery stolen from our tithes, was to die. But not in an alley and not by a knife in the dark. His death would be a sign, a beginning. We gathered in a chamber beneath the very manufactorum where he ruled. The air was thick with incense and blood. They gave me the blade, not the jagged knife from my first kill, but a curved ritual weapon etched with sigils that shimmered faintly in the glow of the braziers. Its weight was perfect, as though made for my hand. "You will be the voice," they said. "You will make them see." I climbed the service ladders into the overseer's chambers as the night shift droned below. He was feasting while the workers starved, wine dripping down his jowls, his fingers heavy with rings. When he saw me, he reached for a weapon, but too slow. I moved like a whisper. The blade took him across the throat in one stroke. He gurgled, clutching at the wound, his eyes bulging with disbelief. Before his body fell, I pressed my bloodied hand against the wall, leaving the cult's mark burning in crimson for all to see. When the workers arrived the next morning, they found not only their overseer's corpse but a message. The Emperor does not see you. We do. By the next day, rumors raced through the hab levels. The workers spoke of a shadow army, of justice from the underhive, of gods who answered when the throne did not. The Arbites cracked down harder, but the harder they cracked, the more cracks appeared. I had become something else now. Not just a follower, not just a killer. I was a symbol. The Arbites did not take long to answer. The overseer's corpse had barely cooled before their boots thundered through the hab blocks. Entire levels were sealed. Families dragged screaming into transports, the unlucky shot in the open as an example. They called it a cleansing operation. We called it what it was, fear. But fear, I had learned, was a blade that cut both ways. Their brutality did not silence the whispers of the people. It fed them. Every family left broken, every starving child, every body left to rot in the ash. These became our sermons. When the Arbites demanded loyalty to the throne, the hab dwellers saw only corpses. And in their grief they began to look elsewhere. They began to look to us. The cult moved like smoke. Shrines appeared in places no Arbite could reach, beneath collapsed hab blocks, inside sewage ducts, behind false walls in manufactorums. Our symbols were scrawled in blood across bulkheads and hab gates. Some were subtle, others brazen. It did not matter if they were washed away. The people had already seen. I led more strikes. Never random, never wasteful. A tithe clerk here, an Arbite sergeant there, each chosen with purpose. Always in public, always leaving behind the mark. And always when I felt the blood spray across my hands, the voices filled me, guiding me, urging me further. One night they gave me a mask. It was wrought of iron, shaped like a screaming face, its surface blackened with soot. When you wear this, they said, you are no longer yourself. You are the herald. The first time I wore it, I walked through a crowd of workers who had just finished their shift. They parted before me, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Some whispered prayers beneath their breath, not to the Emperor, but to me. I felt the weight of their faith pressing into me like chains and wings at once. For the first time I understood. We were no longer simply surviving. We were building something. The Arbites tried to root us out. Raids struck our shrines and blood flowed freely. But no matter how many they killed, more rose in their place. The people were tired of fear. They wanted vengeance, and we gave it form. It was then, as the cult swelled, that the voices grew darker. Not whispers now, but thunder. Not promises alone, but commands. They demanded more than blood. They demanded transformation. And I, fool prophet chosen, I listened. The first sacrifices were not chosen by us. They were chosen by the voices. It began with dreams. I saw faces in the dark, faces of men and women I had never met, yet whose names I knew upon waking. Their sins were whispered to me: betrayal, greed, cowardice. At first I doubted, but when I spoke these names to the elders of the cult, they only bowed their heads. The gods are speaking through you, they said, so we obeyed. The chosen were taken, not with rage but with ceremony. They were bound in chains and led into the deep tunnels, where the air was thick with rot and oil. There before the altar of black iron they were laid upon the stone, candles guttered in the stagnant air, their smoke curling into shapes that seemed almost alive. I was given the knife again, though now it was no mere blade. It burned faintly with a glow that hurt the eyes, its edge whispering as if alive. When I raised it, the voices surged within me, louder than ever, their hunger gnawing at my bones. The first cut opened flesh, but the second opened something deeper. Their screams did not echo like mortal sounds. They twisted, warped, became a chorus that filled the chamber. Blood poured not only onto the altar but into the stone itself, vanishing as though the earth drank it. And when the final breath rattled from their lips, the braziers roared higher, their flames shifting from green to a violent, impossible crimson. The others fell to their knees, their foreheads pressed against the stone. But I, my hands dripping with blood, could not kneel, for in that moment I saw. The veil tore for a heartbeat, and beyond it lay a truth vast and terrible. Shapes writhed in the void, too immense to name, their laughter like storms breaking across eternity. One gazed back at me, many eyes, many mouths. A face that was not a face, and in its gaze I felt both annihilation and love. I wept, though whether from horror or ecstasy I could not tell. When the vision faded, the chamber was silent but for the hiss of the braziers. The body was gone. Nothing left but a smear of blackened ash upon the altar, and I knew then the Emperor was dead to us. The gods of the abyss were not only real, they were present. They had tasted us. They hungered for more. That night, as I stumbled back into the hab levels, the air itself felt different. The ash storms howled like laughter. Every shadow seemed to twitch with unseen movement. And the people, those who saw the mask upon my face, did not look away. They bowed. They whispered prayers. We were no longer rebels. We were no longer forgotten. We were his children no more. We were theirs. The sacrifices changed everything. Before, we had been a rumor, a shadow movement whispered about in the corners of the hab levels. But after the first offerings, after the visions and the blood-drenched altars, the cult was no longer merely hidden, it was alive. It breathed through the city's veins like a fever. Where once we had been cautious, now we moved openly. Our symbols no longer hid in cracks and ducts. They burned on bulkheads, etched into the walls of manufactorums, painted across the very gates of Arbite precincts. Entire shifts of workers began refusing their tithes, their rations, their quotas. When Arbits came to enforce the law, they vanished into tunnels and never returned. The whispers became chants. The chants became songs, and the songs became war cries. I wore the iron mask everywhere now. It was no longer a ritual vestment. It was my face. Children reached for my robes when I passed, smearing their fingers with the ash I carried. Women and men alike knelt and muttered my name as though it were a prayer. Yet my name no longer belonged to me. Even my reflection was fading. When I looked into the shards of a cracked mirror, I no longer saw the starving boy from the hab levels. I saw a stranger, eyes burning with light that had no place in a human skull. The Arbits responded with fire. They sealed entire sectors, deploying shock troops and heavy weapons. The city's air filled with the sound of suppression fire and the wail of alarms. But the harder they struck, the faster we spread. Sabotage pipelines, crippled patrols, ambushed convoys, we were everywhere. Their order collapsed into paranoia. And then came the night we seized the manufactorum itself. Thousands of workers rose as one, armed with tools, stolen laser guns, and the sheer desperation of decades. I led them from the front, the mask blazing with the glow of our braziers, the ritual blade in my hand. As we stormed the upper levels, the overseer's banner was torn down and burned, replaced with the mark of the gods etched in blood across the steel. When the fighting ended, the manufactorum belonged to us. For the first time in living memory, the machines fell silent, not from breakdown, but from refusal. The tithe convoy stopped. The city above shuddered. That night, in the captured overseer's chamber, the elders of the cult gathered around me. The braziers burned low, their flames now violet and black. One of them spoke. "You are no longer a herald. You are the voice. I felt the truth of it settle in my chest like a blade and a crown all at once. Outside, thousands of voices chanted in unison, a sound like the heartbeat of the city itself. The gods were not just whispering anymore. They were watching. They were waiting. And for the first time I felt the weight of what I had become. Not merely a killer. Not merely a rebel. A prophet, a weapon, a promise. Chapter 3. Fire and Chains. The Manufactorum's silence was our victory, but it was also our death warrant. For a brief moment, we held dominion over an entire district of the hive, a fortress of steel and fire carved from the very bones of our oppressors. But victories in the Imperium do not remain unnoticed. The machine world is a vast, grinding beast, and any interruption in its endless tithe is felt across the stars. When our Manufactorum ceased its production, when our convoys no longer rumbled to the void docks, when the engines of the city above sputtered without fuel, the Imperium's gaze fell upon us like the opening of an ancient eye. It began with silence. Vox traffic cut across the city. Whole hab blocks were sealed. Their inhabitants never heard from again. Then the Arbites vanished, their precinct fortresses abandoned as though swept clean by an unseen hand. For a single night the streets lay quiet, broken only by the glow of our braziers and the muttering of prayers. Some thought we had already won. They whispered that Terra itself had fallen, that the Emperor's throne no longer shone, that we had broken the Imperium with nothing but our faith and fury. Then came the thunder. Dropships pierced the night sky, trailing fire. They descended not like machines but like meteors, tearing the heavens open with their fury. The ground shook with the impact of their landings, the air filled with the shriek of engines and the crack of last fire. Regiments of Astra Militarum poured from their steel coffins, faceless behind their rebreathers, banners snapping with the aquila of the Imperium. Tanks rumbled through the Manufactorum gates, their treads crushing the corpses of those too slow to move. The city was no longer ours. It was a battlefield. I remember the first time I saw them in the flesh. Guardsmen, their uniforms stained with ash, their voices drowned in the roar of their sergeant's orders. They moved as a single organism, disciplined and merciless, advancing with the cold inevitability of a glacier. My followers, armed with tools and stolen rifles, broke against them like waves against stone. Blood slicked the floors of the Manufactorum, and the air tasted of iron and promethium. But it was not only guardsmen who came. The Inquisition followed in their shadow, a figure cloaked in black vox-amplified voice ringing across the burning district like a sentence passed by a god. He spoke not to us but to the soldiers under his command, a sermon of annihilation. "Purge them all," he declared, and the word echoed across every corridor, every stairwell, every chamber. The cult faltered. For the first time since the gods had whispered, I saw fear in their eyes. The soldiers of the Emperor did not fight like overseers or enforcers. They did not tire, they did not waver, they did not doubt. They came with the conviction of faith just as burning as our own. That night the Manufactorum burned. The sky was red, ash fell like snow, and the screams of the dying rose like hymns. I stood at the highest balcony, the mask searing my skin from within, and I wondered if this was the price of prophecy. To build something only so it could be broken, to ignite a fire only so it could be drowned in blood. Yet even as the city crumbled beneath the heel of the Imperium, I heard the whispers again. Louder now, clearer. They spoke not of defeat but of transformation. The gods were not abandoning us, they were testing us. The purge spread with mechanical precision. Block by block, corridor by corridor, the guardsmen advanced, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Where once there had been chants and laughter around the braziers, there was now only the stink of charred flesh and the hiss of cooling blood. The Manufactorum's furnaces, once ours, burned again, but this time as pyres for the bodies of my followers. The air turned thick with smoke, choking us even in the tunnels, turning every breath into a struggle. The Inquisitor was everywhere and nowhere. I never saw his face, but his presence moved like a phantom across the city. His voice poured through vox grills, his edicts scrawled in burning ink across walls where our symbols had once stood. He did not need to shout. His words were simple, sharp, and unbreakable. There is no redemption for the faithless, only fire. The guardsmen repeated it like a catechism as they marched, each kill sanctified not as duty but as devotion. Still, the cult fought. We struck from shadows, dragging soldiers into vents, ambushing patrols with blades scavenged from broken machines. Each death we dealt felt like a triumph, but each one cost us 5 more. The gods whispered that this was the way of it, that blood was the only coin worthy of purchase, that suffering itself was the altar on which our faith was proven. And I, fool or prophet, believed. But belief is a fragile shield when the dead are piled so high. I began to see it in the eyes of the people: hesitation. Mothers clutching their children deeper in the tunnels rather than sending them to the fire. Fathers who once carved our sigils into their skin now hiding their hands in shame. The fervor was fading. Fear gnawed at the edges of our devotion, and I felt it gnaw at me as well, and yet there was something else. When I walked among the survivors, mask blazing in the torchlight, they still fell to their knees. They still whispered my name, though their voices trembled. I was no longer merely their leader. In their eyes I had become something more. A living symbol. A vessel of the gods' wrath. It terrified me, not because of what they believed, but because of what I felt in my own blood. At night, when the fires burned low and the screams outside echoed into silence, I looked into the polished steel of my blade and saw my reflection change. My eyes glowed faintly, unnaturally, and my skin beneath the mask felt as though it were crawling, reshaping. The whispers no longer came only when I prayed. They were constant now, a chorus behind my thoughts, urging, shaping, remaking. One night during a raid, I stood before a squad of guardsmen. They raised their rifles in perfect unison. I should have died in that instant, torn apart by las fire. Yet as they pulled their triggers, their weapons spat only sparks. The air rippled around me like heat over a forge, and I heard one soldier scream, dropping his rifle as though it burned him. I struck them down, but the truth haunted me more than the kill. That was no trick of chance. The gods had intervened. Through me. The Inquisition must have sensed it, because the very next day their wrath redoubled. They unleashed fire from the skies. Gunships circling above, bombarding entire sectors without hesitation. Blocks where my followers once lived became nothing but smoking craters. The city was no longer being purged. It was being erased, and yet as I stood in the ruin, ash clinging to my mask, I felt no despair. Only inevitability. The gods were pushing me toward something greater, though I dared not name it. The whispers grew too loud for me to ignore, and when I slept, my dreams were not my own. They showed me visions of a throne of rusted iron, a crown of bone, a legion of the damned kneeling at my feet, and behind it all laughter, not cruel but endless, joyous, like the echo of eternity. I woke trembling, and for the first time, I wondered if I still belonged to myself. The tunnels had become a labyrinth of ghosts. Once they had thrummed with the movement of thousands. Our makeshift shrines, our hidden caches, our braziers burning in secret alcoves. Now they were silent but for the distant rumble of explosions and the drip of water from cracked pipes. Every corner smelled of smoke and scorched metal. Shadows played across the walls like the remnants of a vanished congregation. Word spread that the Inquisitor himself had descended into the Underhive, no longer content to direct the purge from orbit or the fortified command posts above. He had come down into the filth and ruin where we had taken root. This was no longer a campaign of extermination from a distance. This was a hunt, He stalked the tunnels like a predator, his acolytes and sanctioned psychers scouring every vent, every duct, every bolt hole where we might hide. We found their marks on the walls, wards of flame and purity etched in high Gothic, symbols that burned our eyes when we tried to deface them. And yet, even in our desperation, the gods still spoke. I heard them louder than ever, rising over the thunder of the guards' tanks and the hiss of their flamers. They spoke to me not as a whisper but as a command, like the tolling of a great bell across the black void. They told me to lead, to rise, to embrace what I had always feared. I tried to resist. In the hidden chambers I still knelt before the altars, still burned offerings of blood and oil, still recited the chants as I had been taught. But my prayers were changing. The words spilled from my lips like something remembered rather than learned. I no longer needed the elders to guide me. They too had begun to kneel before me, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, but blazing with the reflection of my mask. In the dim glow of the braziers, I began to see the truth. I was becoming the very thing I had once despised. Not merely a servant of the gods, but their vessel, their mouth, their blade. My skin itched constantly as if something beneath it were struggling to be born. In the silence of the tunnels I would catch glimpses of my hands, fingers trembling with a strength that did not feel human, veins pulsing with a rhythm that was not mine. Then came the night of the psychic storms. We had gathered in one of the last intact chambers, huddled around the flickering flames when the air itself began to shudder. Sparks danced across the walls. The smell of ozone filled the chamber. Above us the city trembled with bombardment, but this was something deeper, something unseen. The sanctioned psychers of the Inquisition were combing the hive, casting their minds through every tunnel, searching for me. I felt them like fingers scraping against my skull, a pressure that grew sharper with every heartbeat. I rose, clutching my ritual blade, and for the first time I spoke not to my followers, but through them. The words poured from me like molten metal, alien yet familiar, and they echoed off the stone walls with a resonance that made the flames bend. My followers fell to their knees as one, not in fear, but in ecstasy. They saw something in me, light, darkness, or both, that even I could not name. And then I heard another voice. Not the gods, not my own. A man's voice, clear and steady, cutting through the storm like a blade. You are found. I turned and saw him at the far end of the tunnel. Cloaked in black, his rosette glinting faintly in the dim light, the Inquisitor stood with his pistol raised. His acolytes fanned out behind him, their eyes glowing with sanctioned power. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply spoke as though he were pronouncing sentence. The psychers beside him reached into my mind again, but this time I did not falter. Something in me pushed back. The air between us cracked like ice. The walls groaned. My followers trembled as the flames turned black. I felt the gods inside me, not as whispers now, but as a surge, a tide rising against the rocks. My mask burned against my skin. My blade trembled in my hand. The Inquisitor took one step forward. Yield, he said. And for a heartbeat I almost did. But the gods roared. The tunnel closed in around us, a cathedral of stone and shadow, as though the hive itself had become the stage for judgment. My followers clung to the walls in silence, torn between awe and terror, their eyes darting between the black flames that licked the braziers and the figure who stood unmoving at the tunnel's mouth. The Inquisitor's presence was suffocating. His armor was simple yet immaculate, a carapace polished not for vanity but for purpose. The rosette upon his chest seemed to radiate its own light, a pale and terrible glow that made the darkness recoil. His pistol was leveled at me, steady, unshaken. In his left hand he held nothing, yet I could feel the weight of it as though the entire Imperium stood in that clenched fist. Behind him, The psychers murmured in unison, their voices like a low chant. Threads of force shimmered in the air around them, weaving into a net that sought to close around me. I felt them crawling at the edges of my mind, trying to bind me, chain me, silence the roar that had become my very heartbeat. And yet, as they pressed in, something vast stirred within me. Not a single voice now, but a chorus, not whispers, but hymns of war and madness. It surged through my veins, rattled my bones, burned my throat until I could no longer remain silent. "You speak of yielding," I said, my voice layered with something deeper, something not wholly mine. "But you do not understand. I am not yours to command. I am not yours to judge." The Inquisitor did not flinch. His eyes, sharp as blades, cut through the flickering dark. "You are already judged." His words struck like hammer blows. My body trembled, torn between the weight of his authority and the tide rising within me. My mask burned hotter, its edges biting into my flesh. My followers began to wail and prostrate themselves, clawing at the stone as though the gods themselves had descended among them. The psychers cried out as they tightened their net, threads of psychic fire wrapping around me like chains. For a moment I staggered. My knees buckled. I could feel the pressure driving into my skull, threatening to crush me. But then, something inside me snapped. The black flames erupted upward, devouring the torches. My mask split with a blinding crack of light, but it did not fall. It fused to my skin. My blade flared with impossible fire, runes etching themselves across its steel. My scream was not human. It shook the tunnel, a howl that came from countless throats. The psychers reeled back, their chant shattering into cries of pain as blood poured from their eyes. The net dissolved into smoke. The Inquisitor alone stood firm, though his pistol arm trembled for the first time. The gods spoke through me, and their words rolled like thunder. "We are not found. We are revealed." My followers surged forward, screaming in ecstasy, their bodies convulsing as the dark flame spread among them. They fell upon the acolytes, tearing at them with hands and blades, heedless of last fire and steel. The tunnel became a charnel house of shrieks and gunfire. The Inquisitor fired once, the shot burning through my shoulder. Flesh seared, bone cracked. Yet I did not fall. I turned to him, my voice no longer my own, but a chorus of damnation. "You cannot stop this," I said. "You cannot stop me." For the first time I saw hesitation in his eyes. Not fear, never fear, but recognition. He understood what I was becoming. He knew he was too late, and in that moment I knew it too. The tunnel was no longer a place of stone and shadow. It had become a wound in reality itself. The walls bled black fire. The air screamed as if it had lungs. My followers, writhing in ecstasy, tore into the Inquisitor's acolytes with bare hands, heedless of their own flesh burning beneath holy wards and gunfire. I felt my body unravel and reform with each heartbeat. My mask had fused to my face completely, its edges pulsing like living flesh. My eyes burned with light I could no longer shut out. My voice came in echoes, as though the gods themselves were speaking in chorus through my lungs. The wound in my shoulder sealed itself with tendrils of living shadow. My blood hissed where it struck the floor, etching runes into the stone. I no longer held the blade. The blade held me, guiding my arm with purpose not my own. The Inquisitor advanced through the carnage, unshaken even as his acolytes screamed and burned around him. Each step was a pronouncement. He was the Imperium given flesh, relentless, inevitable. His pistol barked again, another shot searing into my chest. The pain was real, but it no longer mattered. I felt the wound expand into something greater, like a doorway opening inside me. I raised my hand, not in defense but in command. The black flame surged forward, engulfing the psychers. Their screams rose into a piercing harmony before silence claimed them. Their bodies crumbled into ash, their souls torn free and devoured by the unseen. My followers howled their devotion, bathed in the glow of impossible fire. The Inquisitor alone remained untouched, though even he faltered beneath the weight of what I had become. He lifted a small device from his belt, a sigil glowing with the seal of Terra itself. The rosette, the full authority of the throne condensed into a single mark. Its light cut through the flames, searing my vision. For a moment I staggered. The gods inside me recoiled, shrieking with fury. My voice broke into 1,000 whispers at once. But then I understood. Even the rosette, even the Emperor's own seal, was powerless here. Not because it lacked strength, but because I no longer belonged to the realm it ruled. I was no longer bound by the judgments of men or the decrees of Terra. I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. I stepped forward, my blade raised high. The shadows writhed around me, forming wings of smoke and flame that scraped the ceiling. My followers fell prostrate, their voices breaking into chants of madness. The Inquisitor stood his ground, his eyes locked on mine. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "Then you are lost." And I, "No, we," answered with a voice that shook the hive to its foundations. "No. We are found." The blade descended. The tunnel vanished in light and fire. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Warp. When the light faded, the tunnel was gone. Not destroyed, erased. The stone, the braziers, the shrieking of acolytes and the chanting of my flock, all had been swallowed in an instant of impossible brilliance. Only silence remained, a silence so deep it seemed to smother breath itself. I stood at the heart of it. My body, no, not mine, not entirely. My form flickered at the edges, skin bending into shadow and back again, limbs elongated and shrinking in unnatural rhythm. The mask that had fused to me now pulsed like a living organ, its runes beating in time with my heart. The blade I carried was not steel anymore. It hummed with whispers, a sliver of the god's will made manifest. The Inquisitor lay broken. His armor was shattered, his pistol a melted ruin beside him. Yet even as blood seeped from his wounds, his gaze did not falter. He looked at me not with fear, but with that same unshaken defiance. His lips moved, forming words too soft for mortal ears, but I heard them clear as thunder. "The Emperor protects." And then his breath left him. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt the hive itself shudder. The floor beneath me cracked, veins of light spreading through the stone like molten glass. The air filled with a low hum as though the walls were straining against something vast and unseen. Above, the bombardments had ceased. The Imperial Guard's artillery, the thunder of their tanks, even the shrieks of their Valkyries, all had fallen silent. They too had felt the rupture. For a moment the entire city held its breath. Then came the first scream. It was not human. It tore through the hive like the call of a horn blown at the dawn of a war unending. Shadows burst from the cracks, coiling upward, devouring the light. My followers, those who had survived, fell to their knees, clutching their faces, their mouths stretched into smiles too wide, too broken, their voices rising in praise. The gods had not merely spoken. They had answered. I looked down at my hands, and I saw what I had become. Not man, not priest, not servant, vessel, herald. The opening act of something greater than this hive. Greater than this war, greater even than the Imperium itself. And as the screams multiplied, as the city above began to collapse under the weight of my ascension, I realized a truth that froze what little remained of my mortal soul. This was not victory. This was the beginning. The hive began to unravel. The first tremors split through the underhive like the cracking of a world's spine. Walls buckled, hab blocks above groaned as supports gave way, and rivers of ash and sewage poured into the depths. Entire warrens collapsed in seconds, burying thousands in choking dust. But their screams were not cries of fear alone. Many echoed with fervor, their voices lifting in mad praise as the god's touch spread like wildfire. The black flames I had unleashed seeped upward, climbing walls, devouring steel and flesh alike. They did not burn as mortal fire burns, they consumed truth itself, twisting reality into shapes that should not exist. Statues of the Emperor melted into obscene parodies, their features shifting into leering visages that whispered as people passed. Fox networks screamed with distortion, carrying hymns of devotion in my voice though I had not spoken. Above, the Imperium reeled. The guard regiments entrenched in the mid-hive faltered as entire companies were swallowed by fissures opening beneath their lines. Tanks stalled, their engines choked with black ash. Soldiers fired wildly into the dark as the whispers crawled into their ears, turning brother against brother before a shot was even fired. Civilians fled in droves, but flight offered no safety. The further they ran, the more the hive itself betrayed them. Doors sealed shut, stairwells collapsed, transit rails twisted like serpents. Some fell to their knees in prayer to the Emperor. Others turned their eyes toward me, raising their voices in broken chants, calling me not by name but by title, Herald, Mouth of the Gods, the Found One. For the first time, I felt the pull of something vast and impossible moving through me, using me. Every cry of devotion fed it. Every scream of terror fanned its flame. The hive was no longer a city, it was becoming a shrine. The Imperium responded with desperation. Orbital batteries flared above, their bombardments shaking the entire structure. Whole districts were vaporized in firestorms meant to cauterize the infection. The screams of millions rose into the dark, only to echo back stronger, carried on the tide of the gods' laughter. Inquisitorial kill teams dropped into the underhive, their purity seals burning like stars in the abyss. I felt them even before they landed, razor-sharp presences of faith and will cutting against the tide of corruption. But where they struck, my followers surged, throwing themselves into gunfire with ecstatic abandon, their deaths fueling the storm. I stood at the heart of it all, blade raised, wings of shadow unfurled across the cavernous depths. The gods roared through me, louder than the crumbling hive, louder than the guards' guns, louder even than the Emperor's name. And yet, deep beneath the exaltation, beneath the storm of power and madness, I felt a flicker of something else. Doubt. Was I their chosen? Or merely their vessel? A hollow mouth they would use until it broke? The hive continued to collapse, drowning my hesitation in fire and ash. The hive had become a battlefield of gods and men. Ash choked the air, turning day into twilight. Spires toppled like felled trees, crashing into the depths, burying districts beneath oceans of rubble. The black fire rose higher, reaching into the sky, a wound in reality visible even from orbit. It was no longer a city. It was a beacon. The Imperium could not allow it to stand. From the void above, thunder rolled. Dropships pierced the storm clouds, their hulls painted in the livery of the Inquisition, of the Guard, and of something more terrible. Their descent shook the hive, a rain of steel and fury. The first to land were the Kasrkin, elite shock troopers clad in carapace blackened by war. They poured into the mid-hive ruins with precision, their hellguns burning holes through the flesh of my disciples. Where the guard faltered in fear and madness, the Kasrkin advanced without hesitation, Vox discipline unbroken even as whispers clawed at their minds. They were blades of the Emperor forged for this very moment, but they were not alone. The ground shook with heavier boots. Shadows fell across the firestorm. From the dropship strode giants, Astartes, Their armor bore no heraldry of bright banners or holy litanies, only the muted black of death. The sigil upon their pauldrons was unmistakable, the black cross of the Death Watch. The Imperium had sent hunters, not to save the hive, it was already lost, but to end me. I felt their presence as one feels the weight of mountains. Each carried not only bolter and blade, but the will of 100 worlds, the faith of 1,000,000 voices, and the burning hatred of the Emperor's angels. They moved with terrifying purpose, their every step a sentence of death. My followers screamed in both terror and ecstasy, hurling themselves at the giants. Bolters barked, and bodies were torn apart in sprays of gore and ash. Chainswords roared, cleaving through the faithful like wheat. For every disciple who rose, a dozen fell, yet still they came, fuel for the flame, blood for the gods. From afar I watched their advance, and my heart twisted with something I had not felt since childhood. Not fear, but recognition. These were the Emperor's chosen, as I had once believed myself to be. They were what I might have been, unyielding, unbroken, pure. The gods inside me roared with fury, demanding I strike, demanding I tear down these interlopers who threatened their ascension. Power surged in my veins, writhing at my fingertips, begging to be unleashed. Yet for a moment I hesitated. The Death Watch captain stepped into view, his helm scarred, his sword glowing with sanctified fire. His voice, amplified through the vox, rang across the burning ruins. Heretic, vessel, abomination, you will not ascend. The air shuddered as his words clashed with the gods' whispers inside me. My blade shook in my grasp, its runes burning brighter. My wings of shadow unfurled wider, scraping the sky, blotting out the falling ash. This was no longer a war for the hive. This was a war for my very soul. The air itself seemed to split as I descended into the ruins, my shadow falling long and jagged over the fractured streets. The cultists who remained dropped to their knees, chanting, sobbing, tearing at their own flesh in devotion, while the Astartes raised their bolters and leveled them upon me. The first volley came like thunder. Explosive shells screamed through the air, tearing through masonry and disciples alike. I lifted my hand and the warp answered. The rounds detonated mid-flight, bursting into fireballs that hung in the air before collapsing into spirals of unnatural flame. The screams of the dying rose higher, but I heard only the gods whispering through me. Destroy them, I obeyed. The ground split at my command, jagged spears of obsidian thrusting upward, impaling those who sought to encircle me. My wings carried me above the shattered street, and from the void of my voice I unleashed a bellow not of man, but of the abyss itself. Mortals clutched their ears, blood spilling from them, while even the giants of the Death Watch staggered beneath the weight of the sound. But they did not falter. One surged forward, a warrior clad in Terminator plate, his storm bolter spitting fire even as he swung a power fist the size of a man's chest. He met my blade in a crash that shook the earth, the rune-etched weapon hissing against the charged gauntlet. Sparks and warp light exploded outward, painting the ruins in sickly hues. For a moment man and monster were locked, neither yielding. Another came from the side, his chainsword revving with a shriek like a tortured soul. I twisted wing and talon slashing, tearing ceramite and flesh in one stroke. The warrior fell, but even dying his eyes burned with the fire of faith. It was not fear I saw, it was contempt. Their captain moved last. He advanced not with haste, but with inevitability, as though the outcome of this battle was already carved into the Emperor's throne. His blade, wreathed in golden light, cut through the smoke and shadows as he raised it toward me. "Creature of lies," he said, voice steady, each word like a strike. "You will not take this world." I laughed, though the sound was broken, warped, echoing with voices not my own. "This world is already mine." We met in a storm of fury. His blade struck with the weight of righteousness, cleaving through the warp flesh that armored me. My sword countered with the venom of the gods, searing the sanctified steel with corruption that hissed and spat. Sparks, fire, and ichor painted the battlefield. Around us, cultists died in droves. Imperial troopers screamed and burned, the hive collapsing into a grave. But all of it blurred, reduced to nothing but the clash of two wills. One man, one abomination. Every strike he made seemed to cut not only flesh but the memory of who I had once been. And every strike I returned pushed me deeper into the abyss, further from the boy who had once whispered prayers in the dark. Above us, the black fire roared higher, tearing at the veil between realms. The gods watched. They demanded I prevail. And yet somewhere deep within the ruin of my soul a question lingered like a dying ember. Whose voice was truly louder, theirs or his? The captain's blade sang through the air like a hymn. Each strike was a prayer of execution, a litany of judgment carved into the marrow of the world. My own blade screamed in answer, the runes along its length flaring like dying stars. Every parry a hiss of fury from the gods within me. The battlefield narrowed to a single heartbeat. The crash of our weapons louder than the falling spires and the screams of dying thousands. He pressed forward, relentless, each blow forcing me back toward the yawning pit of warp fire that had opened where the manufactorum once stood. My wings lashed the air, clawing at the ash, sending shock waves of psychic force that hurled debris and bodies alike into the chasm below. Still he came on undaunted, the Emperor's vengeance made flesh. The gods roared, their voices twining around my thoughts, pouring their hunger through my veins. They showed me visions, worlds burning at my command, star systems trembling at the whisper of my name, immortality born of damnation. All it would take was to let go, to let them in fully, to surrender the last ragged scrap of humanity clinging to my soul. For a heartbeat, I wavered. The captain's blade cut a gash across my chest, molten ichor spilling out like liquid night. He stepped close, helm almost touching mine, the golden glow of his weapon casting his shadow over me. "It isn't too late," he growled through his vox grill, voice low but carrying. "End it. Burn the lies from yourself. Fight them." His words struck like thunder, not because of their force but because of their echo. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layered whispers of my patrons, I felt the faintest pulse of who I had once been. The boy who had begged the Emperor for deliverance in the dark. The boy who had believed. But the gods are not patient. They surged forward like a tide, their power flaring so violently that cracks split the very ground around us. The chasm of warpfire widened, tendrils of unreality coiling upward, caressing my wings, my blade, my face. Their promise filled me, sweet and venomous. "Strike him down." I roared, not in words but in a sound that split the air. My wings snapped wide, shadow and flame bursting outward in a shockwave that sent even the Death Watch staggering. My blade swung in an arc, fueled by their will, aimed to cleave the captain in two. But in that moment, just as the gods poured themselves through me, my eyes met his. Through the cracked lenses of his helm I saw no hatred, no fear, only grim resolve. Only a man doing his duty even at the cost of his soul. And in that heartbeat something broke, not in him but in me. The strike faltered. The blade dipped. The power that had been building, the tidal surge of warp, flickered, trembled. The gods shrieked in fury, clawing at my mind, tearing at my veins. My wings convulsed, dissolving into ash and shadow. The captain seized the moment, his sanctified sword plunging forward straight through my chest. The world went white. Sound fell away. The fire roared upward, but it was distant, muted like a dream. I felt the gods tearing from me, screaming their rage as they were dragged back into the abyss. I felt my own blood spilling out, hot and heavy, mingling with the ash beneath me. And yet, In that hollow silence there was a strange alien peace. The captain pulled his blade free. I fell to my knees. Around us the battle still raged, but it was as though the hive itself held its breath. I remember, I whispered, my voice no longer warped but human, cracked, small. The captain said nothing. He simply stood over me, sword lowered, watching. The god's whispers faded, replaced by a dim, steady light. Not warm, not cold, simply there. Perhaps it was the Emperor. Perhaps it was nothing at all. Perhaps it was only the last flicker of a soul too stubborn to die in darkness. I fell forward into the ash, into the fire, and the hive burned on. Chapter 5. The abyss consumes. The hive lay in ruin, its once mighty spires reduced to jagged teeth gnawing at a sky still painted with ash. The manufactoria, the hab blocks, the sanctums, all of it had become a grave. The fires raged unchecked. Black smoke carried across continents, and from orbit the planet glowed as though marked by the brand of damnation. The Imperium declared it a victory. Official records inscribed by administratum scribes would say the heresy was contained, the cult uprooted, the corruption burned away by the hand of the faithful. Voxcasts spread the tale of the Death Watch's righteous triumph, of guardsmen who stood unshaken, of Kesserkin who purged every nest of blasphemy with bolter and flame. And the world would be catalogued as cleansed, sanctified once more, returned to the fold of the Emperor's light. But beneath the script of victory lay a truth that could never be admitted. The hive had not been saved. It had been excised like a limb too diseased to heal. Millions were lost, their names unrecorded, their ashes scattered into the void, and though the last of the cultists were hunted and slain, their whispers had already spread like spores, drifting unseen into the minds of survivors. Rumors began almost at once, that the fires which gutted the hive had burned with colors no earthly flame should know, that soldiers who walked the ruins at night swore they heard voices in the ash, promising glory, promising vengeance, that some of the dead had not stayed dead, their shadows lingering even when their bodies were turned to dust. And then there was the matter of the sky. For weeks after the battle, the stars above the planet seemed to ripple, as though viewed through a veil of oil. Navigators aboard void ships whispered of pressure in their third eye, a taste of iron at the back of their throats, a weight that suggested something had brushed against the immaterium too closely here. The Astronomicon still shone, but dimmed, just slightly, just for a time. The Inquisition silenced such talk with executions and sealed reports. The official truth was written and the world was pronounced pure. Yet even purity leaves scars, and those who bore witness carried them forever. Among the ruins, a handful of survivors whispered still of the figure who had led them into madness. They spoke not of a heretic, but of a prophet who had walked the line between godhood and damnation, who had nearly torn open the veil itself. Some spat at his memory. Others prayed. A few even waited, convinced that the shadow they followed would return, reborn in fire, carrying the voices of gods once more. The Imperium had won. But something had been planted in the ashes. In the months that followed, the planet became a wound in the Imperium's records. Administratum clerks stamped it as cleansed, loyal, functional, and moved on to other ledgers. But those who had walked its streets knew better. The guard regiments that survived were broken things. Hardened Kazarkan veterans refused to speak of what they had seen in the Underhive, and when pressed, their reports contradicted one another. Some swore they had faced a mortal man, others an immortal fiend cloaked in wings of shadow. A few claimed they had seen the heretic die, cut down in holy fire. But even in death his voice had carried, echoing through vox channels no one had opened, Whispers spread among the troops. Some dreamt of him nightly, seeing his silhouette in the flames, hearing words they did not understand but could not forget. Others woke screaming, their tongues repeating phrases in languages no tutor could identify. Commissars purged them without hesitation, but the dreams did not stop. The Inquisition, too, bore its scars. Though the records sealed the truth, those who were there knew how close the veil had come to tearing. Some among the Ordo Hereticus warned that such corruption could not have taken root without weakness in the imperial creed itself. Others muttered of darker things, that perhaps the cultist had not been chosen by the gods but had chosen himself, bending their will through force of his own. That thought was far more dangerous than heresy. It was the suggestion that a man might stand among gods and not break. And then came the echoes. Other worlds reported outbreaks, small at first, nothing beyond the usual cults. But the markings were similar, the chants familiar, the same symbols carved into walls, the same words daubed in blood. No one admitted it aloud, but the idea festered. What had died in the hive had not truly ended. It had only seeded the galaxy with fragments of itself. In cathedral vaults, priests raised their voices louder than ever, their sermons trembling with a hidden desperation. They praised the Emperor's eternal triumph, yet every litany sounded more like a plea than a certainty. Faith remained, but faith shaken is not faith strengthened. Among the common folk, fear turned inward. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Families whispered about the things their children drew in the dust, the words they spoke in their sleep. Entire districts burned at the hands of their own enforcers, not for crimes committed but for signs that reminded them of the hive. And in the silence between, something waited. Not a man, not a voice, but a memory. It crept in the shadows of dreams, in the cracks of prayers, in the flicker of a candle's flame. The Imperium believed it had destroyed a heretic. But the galaxy remembered a prophet. The echo of the hive's fall did not stop at the planet's edge. Void ships carried it in silence, their holds filled with refugees and soldiers returning to other war fronts. They did not speak of it openly, but the memory clung to them like radiation. A half-forgotten chant hummed beneath the breath of crewmen. Pilots swore their auspex flickered with runes that did not exist. Navigators traced courses through the immaterium only to feel unseen eyes upon them, as if the warp itself remembered. On neighboring worlds, unrest stirred. A shrine world to the north reported pilgrims daubing their bodies in ash and black oil, declaring themselves the children of the mouth. In a mining colony, laborers whispered of a fire that would cleanse all chains, speaking in voices not their own. Even in the bastion fortresses of the Astra Militarum, soldiers returning from the campaign began marking their armor with sigils they could not explain. The Inquisition moved swiftly, purging whole sects before they could take root. Enforcers executed civilians in droves. Ecclesiarchy preachers raised their sermons to fever pitch, warning of shadowed prophets and lying gods. But the very need for such warnings betrayed a greater truth. The words had already spread, and words, once seeded, do not die. Some said the galaxy itself had been wounded, and that the wound would fester. Others whispered that what had been destroyed in the hive was not the man, nor even the cult, but only a mask. That the true face of the shadow had yet to be revealed, and through the void the rumors traveled further still. Rogue traders carried fragments of the tale to the far edges of the segmentum. Heretics in dark forges scrawled the symbols into machines. Even the enemies of mankind, the Xenos, the traitor, the unclean, took note, sensing that something had stirred in the sea of souls, something born not of demon nor of saint, but of a man who dared to call himself both. The Imperium denied it, smothered it, silenced every tongue that dared speak of the heretic prophet. Yet silence is fertile ground. And in that silence a myth began to grow. The hive was dead, but its shadow stretched across the stars. In the Imperium, the fall of the hive was not silence. It was a scream. The echo of it rolled across the currents of unreality, shaking the tides of raw thought and emotion. Where mortal minds perceived only ash and ruin, the warp perceived a feast. Every death, every cry of terror, every exalted chant bled into its currents. It was not the fall of a city. It was the birth of a song. The four turned their gaze. Khorne's laughter boomed like war drums. So much blood spilled, so much rage and desperation, a symphony of slaughter worthy of his throne. To him it mattered not that the heretic had fallen. What mattered was that he had died standing amidst carnage. That alone was victory. Tzeentch regarded it differently. To the architect of fate, the hive was a single step in a chain of dominoes, each collapse toppling into another. He saw the administratum's lies, the Inquisition's fear, the ecclesiarchy's desperation, and he smiled. Even failure was success if it planted doubt. And the heretic had planted more than doubt. He had planted possibility. Slaanesh purred, basking in the excess of devotion. The cultists' worship had not been hollow but ecstatic, bodies and souls cast willingly into the fire for their chosen prophet. Such surrender was intoxicating, and though their prophet's body was ash, the memory of him lingered in every whispered prayer, every fever dream, every indulgence of those who longed for his return. And Nurgle, slow, patient, eternal, embraced the rot that followed. The hive's death was not an ending but a seeding. Despair clung to survivors like plague. Their grief, their hopelessness, their haunted dreams would fester for generations. In time they would bloom into something new, something resilient, something that could not be scrubbed away by purges or sermons. Each god saw the fall and claimed it. Each believed it served their design. Yet the truth was stranger still. For in the warp, beyond their thrones, the echo remained. It was not wholly theirs. It was not wholly anything. A fragment of will, sharpened by pain, refined by defiance, had imprinted itself on the Imperium. Not demon, not saint, not god. Something else. The memory of a man who had stood before the Imperium and the warp alike and dared to call both liars. The gods laughed, for whether he was their pawn or their rival it mattered little. His echo would feed them still. But in the deepest currents of the Sea of Souls, where even gods turned their eyes away, the shadow lingered and it whispered. At first it was nothing. Just fragments, a sigil scratched in the corner of a hab block, a prayer whispered by a dying guardsman, a symbol carved into the hull of a drifting void ship. Each seemed isolated, meaningless, the detritus of 1,000 scattered heresies. But patterns have a way of finding themselves. In the depths of hive worlds, light years apart, cults began to speak of the voice in ash. On forge moons, laborers daubed their faces in soot before their shifts, swearing it gave them strength. On shrine worlds, pilgrims found themselves drawn to abandoned chapels, where they swore the candles flickered in rhythm with a heartbeat not their own. The Inquisition purged them as they always did, efficiently, mercilessly, without hesitation. Yet the more they burned, the more the whispers returned. They did not grow weaker with suppression. They grew truer. Each execution, each silencing became part of the myth, and soon the myth began to change. It was no longer merely the tale of a heretic who had burned. It became a prophecy, a story of one who had risen from nothing, had stood before gods and empire alike, and had dared to speak. His death, they said, was not an end but a veil, a cocoon, a necessary silence before the return. Some named him the Ash Prophet, others the Unbroken Mouth. In the darkest sects he was called the Fifth Shadow, a whisper of a god not yet born, a rival to the Four. At first, the Chaos Powers laughed. Rival? There could be no rival. Yet in the warp, laughter often masks unease. For myths have power, and power feeds the warp. And the warp reshapes power into truth. And so it was that across the galaxy, in places far beyond the ruined hive, prayers began to turn, small, faltering, desperate, but real, not to the Emperor, not to the Four, but to you, a name not yet spoken aloud but carried in secret, a shadow growing in silence, a seed planted in the heart of eternity.